History is not just a record of what happened. It is a record of what was allowed to be remembered. The Record Corrected examines world history and United States history through the lens of power, how narratives are constructed, distorted, and preserved, and how those distortions shape policy, identity, and conflict. Now, with particular attention to Black American history as a diagnostic lens, this channel challenges popular myths, coalition folklore, and sanitized accounts using primary sources, historical context, and plain language explanation. Now, this space is for anyone seeking clarity, whether you're a casual learner, an engaged citizen, or a policy-minded reader. Specifically, people who value accuracy over slogans and understanding over outrage. Now, the goal here is not consensus, but correction. Progress requires an honest record. The intent of this channel is to empower understanding, thereby inspire progress. Now, how the historical record gets distorted. History doesn't distort itself. People distort it. Usually those with power, incentive, time. What we call the historical record isn't a neutral archive, it's a product. Produced by institutions, filtered through interest, and preserved by those who benefit from it. Now, this video is about how that process works, how narratives are shaped, how inconvenient facts are minimized, and how entire populations can live inside a version of history that was never meant to serve them. Now, the historical record, what is it? The mechanism of distortion. Now, when people talk about history, they're usually referring to the historical record. But the record is not the past itself, but what survives. Now, you have documents, official accounts, archives, curricula. In other words, the historical record is the collection of materials that institutions choose to preserve, teach, and repeat. Now, that choice is where distortion begins. Because not everything is recorded. Not everything is archived. Not everything that happens is allowed to matter. The record is a mirror. It's a filter. The historical relevance selection process doesn't require lying, initially. Only selection. And once a selection is repeated long enough, it becomes history. Now, power decides what survives. Now, once we understand what the historical record is, the next question is simple. Who decides what survives? The answer, power. Those with political power decide which events are documented. Those with economic power decide what is preserved. And those with institutional power decide what is taught. This doesn't require coordination. It doesn't require conspiracy. It's simply how authority functions. Now, when one group governs, they leave records. When another group is governed, they leave traces, if that. Now, over time, records become history, and absence becomes invisibility. When the governed leave only traces. Now, here's an example of what it means to only leave traces. In the 19th century, the British Empire governed Tasmania. The Aboriginal peoples of Tasmania had lived there for tens of thousands of years. They had robust languages, kinship systems, law systems, and most importantly, memory. They, however, did not control the archive. Now, as colonial settlement expanded, violence, displacement, and disease all followed. The population collapsed. Now, what survives in detail are the records of the colonizers, their reports, their letters, their classifications. What survives of the colonized are fragments. Names recorded late, languages hastily reconstructed, entire history hastily scrawled almost entirely by those who replaced them. Now that is what it looks like when power governs completely. The record remains. The people, however, do not. Now, absence is not evidence. Now, one of the most common mistakes people make when reading history is assuming that absence means insignificance. It does not. Absence is not evidence. The lack of records does not mean something didn't happen or that an event or series of events did not occur. Often, it means it simply was not recorded, or that it was recorded and later destroyed, or that it was never preserved. Now, silence in the archive is not neutral. It simply reflects who had the authority to write, the resources to preserve, and the power to decide what mattered, and by extension, matters. Now, when a governed population leaves only traces, the absence of detail is not accidental. It is the outcome of governance itself. Myth versus record. Now, this is where myth enters the picture. When a selective record is repeated long enough, it stops feeling selective. It becomes familiar, comfortable, normal even. Myths aren't usually invented out of nothing. They're built by emphasizing certain facts while omitting others. And over time, that emphasis hardens into a story. And eventually, the story replaces the record. Now, what survives isn't the full history, it's the version that justifies the outcome. When myth replaces record. Now, oftentimes, myth doesn't just sit alongside the record, sometimes it replaces it. Like after the American Civil War, the historical record was clear. The war was fought over slavery. It was preserved in speeches, in secession documents, in contemporary accounts. But slowly but surely, over time, a different story took hold. The lost cause narrative reframed the war as a struggle over states' rights, honor, tradition. Now, that story didn't emerge by accident, it was taught, monumentalized even, printed into textbooks. The record, the truth, became controversial. Narrative as replacement. Now, narratives have consequences. So myths don't stay in books, they shape policy. When a myth becomes accepted history, it changes what feels justified. For example, if the Civil War wasn't about slavery, then Reconstruction becomes overreach. If slavery wasn't central, then inequality becomes accidental. Now, these stories made it easier to justify segregation, disenfranchisement, unequal access to land, education, political power. Policy does not emerge in a vacuum. It grows out of the stories a society tells about itself. Now, when the record is based in myth, story, or narrative, these consequences become real. When record becomes policy. Now, when a myth replaces record, it doesn't stay academic. It becomes policy. In East Asia, the historical record of Imperial Japan's actions during the early 20th century is exhaustive and extensive. There are military documents, eyewitness accounts, international tribunals of mass violence, forced labor, sexual enslavement, all throughout China, subjugated by the imperial military across occupied territories. However, in the decades that followed, a competing narrative emerged, one that minimized or reframed these actions as wartime necessity, liberation, or exaggeration by foreign powers. Now, that narrative did not remain simply rhetorical, it became record. That record was formalized through the normalization in textbooks, shaping official apologies, or even the lack thereof. It influenced diplomatic posture, domestic law. Now, in this specific case, the issue is not cultural misunderstanding, but rather the deliberate elevation of a myth over documented record. Now, as we see in this day, the policy consequences are ongoing. So, the record corrected its mission statement and why the record even matters. Correcting the historical record is not about comfort. It's not about absolution. It's about accuracy. It's about challenging commonly accepted myth and narrative in an era where information warfare and dominance is the norm. Reality is dictated by those with a vested interest in managing the record. History cannot be understood if responsibility is blurred or if power is treated as accidental. Now, sometimes people will have to be held accountable for their place in history. Not to punish the present, but to understand how we arrived here. This channel is not interested in myth. It is interested in records, and incentives, and power. Because progress requires an honest account of the past. And clarity begins with the record.